Good afternoon. This will be your mini lecture for week number 6. We will be talking about memory this week. And so here we go. Here are some of the highlights from the chapter for this week. Basically, our memory is one of our systems within our body, and it helps us organize and keep information in 3 different steps. And so first we need to have encoding, and that's where we actually collect the information and put the information into our memory. We have storage, which is how we maintain that information that we've learned. And then finally would be retrieval, and that's how we get that information by recall when we need it. Our learning that persists over time shows us that we actually have memory for that learning. And so anything that you have learned, whether it's phone numbers, maybe it's a skill, we know that learning has occurred because we have that in our memory and we're able to recall that when we need it. Our ability to get that information back into our consciousness would be considered recall. You know, all that information is up there, but really until we need it and consciously ask for it or try to retrieve it, it's kind of floating around up there. If we learn something and then forgot it, it's important to remember that actually you'll be able to relearn that more quickly than you did originally. There are a lot of different theories regarding memory. One of the ones that I will highlight would be the Atkinson and Shiffrin, and they propose that memory has basically 3 stages. The first is where we collect all that sensory information. And so think about all the stuff that we hear, taste, smell, touch. We collect all of that information, and it's usually put into our short-term memory. Now, we are going to have to rehearse or practice that information so that it's encoded and actually stored. If we rehearse that information, a phone number, a term, and its definition, then it can be sent to long-term memory where we can use it when we need it. We have different types of memories. Your book talked about implicit and explicit memories. So we'll talk a little bit about that difference. When we are learning facts and experiences that we purposely or consciously are trying to remember, those would be our explicit or declarative memories. Again, they're conscious. We're purposely trying to process them and keep them for use. When you're trying to remember terms for the quiz, you're using your explicit memory. We do have memories that actually happen without our awareness or unconsciously, and so they actually happen automatically, and those are called implicit memories. So let's think of an example. Let's say we have an elderly Mr. Jones, that's my neighbor, and he's a retired electrician. And he can easily remember how to wire a light switch, but when I ask him who the President of the United States is, he's unable to remember that information. So what we can conclude is that his implicit memory or unconscious memory, the stuff that comes right to him, is better than his explicit memory or his conscious memory, the things that he's learned, such as the President of the United States right now is Barack Obama. Remember that the explicit memory is a memory of a fact that person can recall if they've rehearsed it enough and that information is in their long-term memory. So let's talk about long-term versus short-term memory. Short-term memory, which is also known as working memory, is where the information comes into right away. It's said that we have the capacity to keep about 7 pieces or chunks of information within our short-term memory. So think about that. Social security number, few more than 7, but a phone number. And so if we rehearse that information, those 7 chunks or 10, then they're going to be transferred to our long-term memory. So again, another name for the short-term memory is our working memory. And that's really where we work to make sure that that information is then transferred into our long-term memory. And, you know, obviously our working memory, our short-term memory is going to depend with age. Obviously, it's going to be easier to learn at a younger age. We hear so many times of children that are in kindergarten or even before kindergarten that are able to learn a second language very easily. And then there are some of us that are older and say, hey, wouldn't it be nice if, and, we attempt to learn that and it takes us a little bit longer. The thing to remember is if we are trying to learn something, whether it is a new language or terms for a course, so we really need to make sure that we have as few distractions as possible, especially the older we get. We really need to be able to focus on that rehearsal of that information so that we're able to push that from the short-term memory into the long-term memory. One of the keys to learning, and perhaps you've heard this before, but I think it's important enough to remind you, especially in this chapter, is that if the material that you're trying to learn is not meaningful to you, you're going to have a harder time to process that, and it's going to be harder for you to remember that. So you're going to remember information if you can relate it to yourself. And so think about that as you're taking some of these courses or if you have on-the-job training. If you are able to take that information and somehow make it usable to you, it will be easier for you to remember. For example, being able to make that information meaningful to you is actually called the self-reference effect. So think about that. How can you take the information within this chapter on memory and make it useful to you? When you're looking at an example of an explicit memory or an implicit memory, can you think of an example within your life or somebody else's that's close to you that will help you remember that definition? If you can, then it really is going to be a little bit easier to recall that information when it comes time for the quiz. Obviously, there are a lot of different things that can affect our memory. One of the things are our emotions. And so we know that emotions can help trigger hormones within our body. And actually, these hormones are going to affect the amount of glucose that's available to fuel brain activity. So it is a good idea to be able to regulate your emotions, especially if you're trying to study for a test, because it's going to help you in the long run learn that information, not memorize it. We all have memories that all it takes is one mention and you remember exactly what you were doing at that time, and that's called a flashbulb memory. For my parents, it was when JFK was shot. I grew up hearing my mom, recalling exactly what she was doing when that happened. In my generation, it seems to be 9/11. I remember being in a store with my 1-year-old and hearing on the radio that one of the towers had fallen and wondering, what was going on, and going home and turning on the news immediately and watching that. And my husband happens to be a federal employee. We were down in the basement, which is where our TV was. And so my daughter's playing and I'm watching this tragedy on TV unfold, and I can hear footsteps upstairs thinking, who in the world is in our house? Well, they had sent my husband home because he was a federal employee and they were concerned that maybe there were going to be some other targets. So that's an example of a flashbulb memory for me. It's something that I remember just as clear today as I did when it actually happened back in 2001. The important thing to remember about flashbulb memories is that we can have trouble remembering those as well, or certain parts of that. And so, as I get older, I'm assuming that there will probably be things that I won't remember as clearly about that day. With memory, we need to talk about forgetting, and actually forgetting is a good thing. Now, as an instructor, you're probably wondering why in the world I would say that. My job is to help you learn information so that you can use that for yourself and your occupation as you go forward. But actually forgetting is very good. Without the ability to forget, can you imagine how overwhelmed we would be with all the information? We're very lucky that as we're sleeping, our body is kind of going through different things and rearranging them. I kind of think of defragging a computer. And I think I used that example in an earlier lecture, but it gives me a really good visual of what happens when we're sleeping. There's no possible way we could remember absolutely everything that we sense in a day. And if you think that's true, do me a favor and keep a list of everything you sense, whether it's sight, sound, touch, feel, in one day, and figure out how many different things you experience in a day and how overwhelming for you that would be if you had to remember absolutely everything that you sensed in that one day. Obviously, our ability to forget is going to be enhanced as we age. And one of the reasons for that is that we see age-related memory decline as our brain areas that are responsible for encoding that new information are usually less responsive in older adults. And I think later on in this semester, we'll actually talk about Alzheimer's and dementia and those type of things. But what we're talking about is cognitive decline, just not that sharpness that there used to be within that brain and its ability to create and retain memories. There are times when we need to remember something, whether it's a test. I find it sometimes when I'm meeting up with somebody that I haven't seen for a long time, maybe I've only met them one more time and we're working together on a project and I can't remember their name. I remember everything they told me about themselves, but I cannot remember their name. And that's really, they have a term called retrieval failure. And that happens a lot. However, I've learned that if I just kind of sit back and relax, it depends on, the person. I might just say, I remember the story you told me about your child, but I cannot remember your name. And then they tell you and it's like, oh yeah, that's right, I remember. Or within a few minutes, if you're not really thinking about it, it might come back. And so it doesn't mean that you don't remember. It's just, it just says or highlights that you're having trouble remembering at that time. So there's some sort of a failure retrieving that information that really does exist. Now, Freud, who we talked about early in the semester, actually talked about how forgetting painful memories, he called it repression, is actually a good way to protect individuals from those painful memories. And Freud said a lot of things that people don't agree with. This is actually one of them that I do agree with. And there's really two sets of thought with this. Some will say if it was so awful, you'll never forget it. You'll remember every part of that occurrence. And there are some that will say, no, you will repress it. And your body does that to protect yourself. And so, you obviously are able to make your own decision. I'm sure that some of you have probably suffered some trauma and can say from experience, no, I remember absolutely everything that happened, or not quite sure, I think I've forgotten some of the stuff. So what I will actually end with is ways to improve your memory, and very common sense ways that all of us can improve our memory. The first one, obviously, is rehearsing that material several times over disrupted study sessions. When students wait until the very last day before the quiz and they start, trying to cram all that information into 5 hours in a row before that final exam, it just really doesn't work very well. It's a lot better if you can take little chunks each day, rehearse that information. I've heard that if you type up your notes versus writing them, so maybe both, it actually uses a different part of your brain. And so that's another way to help remember information when it comes time for a quiz. Another one is, again, trying to make that information so that it's meaningful to you. If there's any way that you can think of an example within your life that mirrors that term or that definition, definitely will be a lot easier for you to remember that information when you need it. Third, think of retrieval cues. And, this can seem kind of hokey, I'm sure, but, it does work. Think about where you were when you were studying those terms. Were you drinking a Mountain Dew? Think about how you felt. How was your mood? And sometimes if you're able to look at those different experiences you had while you were remembering or studying that information, sometimes it's actually easy to retrieve that information as all. Minimize interferences. Anytime you're trying to learn new information, it's best to not have distractions. There are some individuals that feel like they need to be doing something, get yourself one of those stress balls or get a pencil and just kind of move it around in your fingers or something like that. But, best practice would be not studying with the TV on, or studying where there is a party going on, those types of things. Maybe giving yourself 15 minutes of really hardcore studying, rehearsing information, and then walk away, go do something different, and then maybe come back in another, 15 minutes. So, trying to get out of that habit of, oh my gosh, I have to study for 5 hours and it's okay if the TV's on or I'm listening to the radio. Minimize those interferences, and that'll definitely help you. And finally, get some sleep. Obviously, our brain is working very hard while we're sleeping, trying to organize and consolidate the information. It is very important for you to get a good night's sleep. So do what you need to do to get that sleep so that your brain is able to help process that information for you for the next day. Okay, I hope to see you again.